Helena, Montana, 1873. Dust lashed across the square like a mocking whistle as a spectacle unfolded on the wooden platform that sent the crowd roaring with laughter. A bride auction. Amid the slurred cries of a drunken auctioneer, a woman stepped forward. Margaret, dark-skinned, slight of frame, yet her back remained straight, her chin unbowed. Men spat tobacco into the dirt. Women whispered behind kerchiefs in disdain. In the chaos, a poor cowhand, with nothing left but $2 raised his voice. $2. The crowd exploded in ridicule. The clink of coins striking the wood sounded dry and final, like a sentence passed. But in Margaret's proud, silent gaze, it was no disgrace. It was the beginning of a journey no one could have foreseen, where $2 would change a destiny and ignite a flame the whole of Montana would bear witness to. The wind whipped through the red dust streets of Helena that day, shrill and jeering like a whistle meant to mock. On the rough wooden scaffold in the square, the rasp of the auctioneer's voice tangled with the stench of sweat, horse, and cheap whiskey drifting from the saloon across the way. A crowd pressed close, men chewing tobacco and spitting into the dirt, women standing farther back with kerchiefs pulled over their mouths, their eyes sharp with both curiosity and scorn. Caleb McGraw stood at the edge, his calloused hand closing around the last 2 silver coins in his pocket. He had come only for salt and a sack of flour. Yet his eyes, he could not say why, fixed on the lone woman standing upon the block. They called it a bride auction. Women from the East, stripped of prospects, driven into the unforgiving West in search of a roof. Too often, that roof proved to be nothing more than the rafters of a brothel or a shadowed room where they were passed from man to man like cattle. This woman, Margaret Hale, was the last offering of the day. The darkness of her skin had drawn laughter and derision the moment she stepped forward. In Montana, a black woman was little more than a target for contempt. Her brown dress was faded, hem frayed where it brushed against splintered planks. Her hair was braided tight, no ornament to soften her plainness. Yet what forced Caleb to draw breath sharp into his chest was the way she carried herself. Her back unbent, her eyes lowered, but her chin never bowed. Not the bearing of the defeated. The auctioneer's rasp rang out. "Here's the last one, folks. A school teacher from far-off Boston, in need of a home. Who'll start the bidding?" The crowd howled. A voice from the rear shouted, "A home? With that black hide, the only home she'll find is a whorehouse." Laughter split the square. Margaret held her ground, clutching a small cloth bag to her chest. She answered with silence. The auctioneer tried again, more urgent now. $10? $5? Nothing. Only boots shifting against the boards and the rasp of mocking laughter. Caleb drew a breath. He owned little. An acre of stubborn earth. A string of half-starved cattle. And what pride a man can keep when he has almost nothing left. Yet in that moment, watching her stand like a mute statue against the storm of jeers, his chest tightened. $2. His words weren't loud, but they split the silence. For a heartbeat, the crowd hushed, then erupted in laughter. "Ha! $2 for a black wife! McGraw, you damned fool! What'll you do with her? Feed her to your cows?" Caleb did not answer. He drew out the coins, laid them on the block. The dry clink of metal against wood sounded like a funeral toll, and yet it was enough. The gavel fell. "Sold to Caleb McGraw for $2 silver." The crowd roared anew, spitting shells and jeers. Someone flung a cracked peanut husk toward the platform. Margaret did not flinch. She stepped down, her posture rigid, her gaze lifting for the briefest instant. Her eyes swept Caleb's, cold as winter lake water, and he felt his hand tremble. He did not know why he'd spoken, why he'd dragged himself into a bond with a stranger. Only this he knew. Had he stayed silent, she would have been dragged away by one of those leering men, her dignity torn to rags. A harsh voice rose from behind, dripping with malice. She was a teacher in Boston, got thrown out for betting her headmaster. The mob howled again, cruel delight flashing in their eyes. Margaret stood unmoving, lips pressed tight, hands whitening on her bag. She did not deny. She did not plead. She endured. And Caleb realized then, whether the lie was true or false no longer mattered. A black woman, a disgraced teacher, a cast-off from the East. Here she was nothing but fodder for laughter. The wind swept red dust around his worn boots. He stepped forward, placed himself at her side. He tipped his hat, a silent gesture that said, "Come with me." She hesitated, then obeyed. The laughter behind them rose like a storm, but her steps did not falter. Caleb glanced at her once more and found in her eyes a strange fire, dim but unextinguished. A fragment of pride no crowd could strip away. He closed his fist around the 2 coins, still warm from his hand, and thought, for the first time in years, maybe he had done something right. The marriage paper landed on the table with a slap, its edges curled with grease and dust. The broker puffed on a cheap cigar, his words slurred with boredom. "Should have been worth 50, but take it. $2 silver is more than enough." Laughter swelled again behind them, low curses lacing the air. Caleb McGraw bent without a word, lifted the paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his pocket. He did not argue. A life of cattle and dust had taught him that silence could be sharper than any retort. To quarrel with brokers and idlers in Helena would earn him nothing but scars. Margaret stood near the doorway, light spilling through the cracked wood, laying across her dark skin. In her eyes flickered something torn between pride and helplessness. She clutched her worn cloth bag to her chest, shoulders trembling faintly, yet no tears fell. Caleb crossed to her. He could feel the stares, men smirking at the discount bride, women whispering that he was a fool. He tipped his hat, his voice steady, unshaken. "I've got a small ranch, nothing much, but it's no saloon." Margaret lifted her chin slightly. In her gaze flashed something hard to name. Not trust, nor gratitude. Only the plain acknowledgement that the road ahead, however bleak, led away from the pit she'd feared, away from the men in the saloon who would have stripped her down to nothing. Outside, dust swirled in the midday sun. Caleb stepped onto the porch without looking back. Margaret followed, her spine straight, though her pace was slow. Behind them, catcalls rang out. "Hey, McGraw! $2 bargain! Don't forget to share it with the boys!" Caleb stopped. The mob roared louder, waiting for his reply. Margaret froze, her knuckles white on the strap of her bag. But Caleb only tugged his hat lower and moved on. Silence carried more weight than curses ever could. They crossed the square. Women pointed, children stared with wide eyes, puzzled why the grown-ups laughed. Each footfall on the wooden planks landed heavy, as if pressing against both their pride. At the hitching post, Caleb loosened the reins, his hand brushing the mane of the old bay horse. He turned to her, Mount up. It's a long ride home. Margaret tightened her grip on her bag, hesitating under the watch of every mocking eye. Caleb saw her falter, so he simply extended his hand. After a breath, she placed her trembling fingers in his calloused palm. He lifted her to the saddle before climbing up behind. The horse moved forward, hooves striking rhythm into the dirt, leaving the jeers fading in the wind. On horseback, no words passed. Caleb felt her shoulders stiff beneath his arm. Her back held rigid, refusing to bend. She would not let them see weakness. The road out of town was carved deep with wagon tracks, dust lifting in waves. Caleb rode in silence, his thoughts tangled around the folded paper in his pocket, the 2 coins gone from his hand, the brief flash in her eyes. He could not say what lay ahead, only that one reckless act had bound his fate to hers. At last, her voice came, low but clear. You didn't have to bid for me, but thank you. My name's Caleb, he said simply. Call me that. The words slipped into the wind, unanswered. Yet in that silence, both of them knew. This was no mere cheap exchange. It was the beginning of something neither could foresee. Before the town's roofs vanished behind them, a voice rang out, hoarse and cruel. Take her home, McGraw! Trash stays trash! Caleb pressed the reins, spurring the horse faster. Margaret lowered her head, but her hands gripped the strap of her bag until they shook. He did not look at her, but within him stirred something heavy and undeniable. Responsibility. From the moment those 2 coins hit the wood, from the instant he caught her gaze, Caleb had taken on the weight of another life. Not for the paper in his pocket, but for something deeper, unnamed. He knew then, what he had bought today was not a wife on parchment. It was a human being. And with that, he had wagered the whole of his own life. The sun sagged low toward the horizon, painting the prairie in a weary gold. A chill wind of early spring scoured the ground still crusted with gravel and patches of ice carrying the sharp scent of dry grass and horse sweat. The road out of Helena stretched on in silence, broken only by the steady thud of hooves and the creak of wagon wheels blending with the long sigh of the wind. Caleb McGraw held the reins firm, eyes fixed ahead. For 10 miles he had said little, and the woman beside him had said nothing at all. The silence was not oppressive but taut, a veil of tension that kept each locked in private thought. Margaret Hale sat straight-backed on the seat, her faded brown dress covering her legs, her hands clutching the worn cloth bag tight. Her gaze traveled outward, over the sweep of prairie and the mist-veiled ridge of mountains far off. There was nothing vacant in those eyes, no dull surrender. Instead, they were sharp, alert, as though memorizing every bend in the trail, every landmark of this strange new world. When the wagon climbed a rise, the view opened, a weathered shack of timber standing alone in the vast grassland, a fence sagging behind it, a cattle pen that looked one strong wind away from collapse. A few gaunt cattle nosed at the first blades of spring grass. Caleb pulled the reins, his voice low and hoarse, as if it carried the breath of the land itself. 26 head, after winter. He didn't look at her as he spoke, but the words fell like a confession. The winter had ravaged every ranch, but for Caleb, the number told the tale plain. From nearly 50 head, now half remained, ribs sharp beneath their hides. Margaret did not answer. She studied the cattle, and her eyes showed no pity, no distaste. They were the eyes of someone used to labor, measuring what could still be salvaged. Caleb saw that, and for the first time since laying 2 coins on the block, he felt a faint glimmer of hope. Perhaps she was not as breakable as he had feared. The horse stopped before the cabin. The roof was patched with planks, light slanting through the gaps. The walls were darkened, cracked, whining with the wind through their seams. Beside it, the lean-to stable leaned hard, its beams half-rotten. Caleb stepped down first, holding up his hand. Margaret hesitated, then set her dark fingers against his sun-rough palm. He steadied her down, saying nothing more. They entered together. The door groaned, hinges shrieking. Inside was a single rough table with 2 chairs, a cold hearth, and a narrow bed draped with a thin, worn blanket. The air smelled of old smoke and damp. Caleb laid his hat on the table and stood, uncertain. To him, this had been shelter enough. Now it was meant to house 2 strangers. He turned, meaning to speak, but stopped at her expression. Margaret's eyes moved over the room without flinching, without disappointment. She examined it as one who had endured hardship before. The warped boards, the cracks, the soot. Her gaze was already weighing what must be mended. Caleb cleared his throat, awkward, trying to break the hush. "It ain't much, but it stood through the winter." Margaret inclined her head. She neither praised nor scorned, but said softly, "A house is a house so long as it's roof and fire." The words halted him. He had braced for bitterness, but instead heard something heartier. Practicality, resolve. Outside, the cattle lowed, bells clinking against the hiss of the grass. Caleb stepped onto the porch, staring out at the herd. His thoughts circled debts, the weight of loneliness, and the long trail ahead. Yet something had shifted, not just because he had brought home a woman, but because of her eyes, eyes that would not bend. She joined him, bag still clutched, gaze on the cattle. Her voice was calm, almost measured. "They're thin, but spring is coming. Grass grows back if tended." Caleb turned toward her. It was no dreamer's remark, but the judgment of someone who knew toil, who had clawed past hunger before. For the first time, he did not feel alone in the fight. The sun sank, shadows stretching long over the crooked cabin. He murmured half to himself, "Maybe. You're not one to break easy." She gave no reply, yet in her dark eyes, he saw the truth. Storms had already passed through her life, and she had not fallen. The wind whistled through the gaps, carrying the distant clang of cattle bells, as if to mark the start of something new. 2 strangers beneath a shanty roof, bound to carve from ruin a shelter that might one day be called a home. The first morning in the crooked house stirred with the familiar sounds of the prairie. Wind sighing through the gaps in the boards, cattle bawling wearily out in the field. The thin cry of meadowlarks carried on the air. Caleb woke stiff from a night spent on the hard bench. He was used to discomfort, but today there was a difference. Another breath in the room, another presence he still wasn't sure how to meet. When he rose, the smell of wood smoke already lingered. The hearth glowed red, a pot of water bubbling low. Margaret knelt by the fire, hands quick with kindling, her braided hair catching the flicker. She hadn't waited for permission. She had set to work. Caleb paused. It wasn't what he expected. He had heard tales of mail-order brides, women timid, waiting for instruction, fearful of a man's glance. Margaret was nothing like that. She moved with the calm of one long acquainted with toil. You're up early, he said, voice rough. She nodded, eyes steady on the fire. If there's a roof, there should be breakfast. You don't keep much in your stores. I found cornmeal, a little fat. I can make cakes. Her tone surprised him. It wasn't pleading, nor dependent. It was the voice of someone taking measure of what was left. They ate simply. Corn cakes browned in the pan, bitter coffee thin as water. When Caleb pushed back his chair to head toward the cattle pens, her voice stopped him. I want to see the herd. If I'm here, I should know what I can do. He stared. No woman had ever spoken to him so. Neighbors' wives stayed by hearth and cradle, not among the corrals. But Margaret, branded worthless by a town, spoke as if she were already part of the labor. He studied her a moment, then gave a short nod. All right, come on. They stepped into the wind. Caleb led her past the leaning fence toward the horse shed. The cattle moved slow, their ribs sharp beneath hides, nosing thin patches of grass. Margaret did not look away. Her gaze narrowed, equal parts pity and calculation. Then she halted. By the paddock stood a dark bay mare, a pale scar running along her flank. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached out, fingertips brushing the mark. This was my father's horse. Her voice was low but unyielding, a knife through the air. Caleb froze. He had never heard such a tone from her. Shock edged with sorrow. He glanced from the horse to her face. You're certain? She nodded once, eyes shadowed. That scar came when my father freed her from an iron trap. I'd know it anywhere. Caleb drew a slow breath. I bought her off a trader. Said she came from Ezekiel Ward's place north of here. At the name, Margaret stiffened. The wind rose, dust curling around the shed. Her eyes darkened with pain and something sharper, anger. Ward, she whispered, the word ground out like stone. Caleb held his tongue, but inside pieces began to fit. The rumor hurled at the auction, her silence against the jeers. And now this mare tied to the wealthiest man in the valley. There was more behind her exile than she had said. They stood in silence. At last, Margaret straightened, voice steady though her hands clenched. I'll work. I won't sit idle and watch things fall apart again. Caleb dipped his head. The truth settled in him heavy. The 2 coins he'd thrown down had bought him more than a wife on paper. They had bought him into a story he had yet to understand. They walked on, circling the pens. He pointed out broken rails, dry troughs. She listened, noting each flaw. Her questions came short and sharp, about seed grass, about breeding stock, about the timing of calves. Caleb found himself answering, surprised at how much she already knew. By the time they returned to the shack, the light was falling. Caleb studied her slight figure and realized he no longer saw helplessness. She was becoming part of the land itself, something weathered but unbroken. At the doorway, he muttered, almost to himself, "You're not like the others." Margaret glanced back, eyes still hard, yet touched with weariness. She said nothing, only gripped her bag tighter and stepped inside. Caleb watched her go, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. His life of solitude had shifted, not because he had taken in a woman, but because she carried a past, a strength, and now a tie to Ezekiel Ward, a man Caleb had never dared to cross. Clouds dragged low across the horizon, dimming the last of the sun. Inside, the fire crackled to life again. 2 strangers, scarred and wary, began their first day together, Not yet partners, not yet family, but already bound to face storms greater than hunger and cold. The days began to turn, one after another, like wagon wheels grinding the red dust of the trail. Yet inside the crooked shack on the prairie, each dawn and dusk carried a different breath than before. Margaret rose before even the rooster called. With the first pale light still hidden behind the cracks in the boards, she was already at the hearth, fire catching beneath her hands, the skillet hissing as thin corn cakes browned and filled the air with their mild, sweet scent. A pot of coffee bubbled low, the smoke curling with the stale musk of old winters, washing it away bit by bit. Caleb often woke to that smell and the crackle of firewood. He had been used to mornings of stale bread and weary silence, but now the table bore a plate of warm cakes, sometimes touched with honey, or a jar of pickled vegetables she had found in a forgotten bin. It wasn't a feast, never more than simple fare, but to Caleb, it eased the weight he carried. After breakfast, he went to the fields with his frayed straw hat and rope across his shoulder. The chores did not change. Mend fences, drive the cattle, break ground for grass seed. Yet he no longer returned to a house that felt like a tomb. In the evenings, something was always new. One day the floor swept clean of months of dust. Another day a vase of wildflowers set on the rough table. Sometimes the blanket was washed and smelled faintly of sun. The house, once silent as stone, began to breathe again, revived under Margaret's hands. Caleb never said it aloud, but he felt it within him, a weight shared, a burden eased. It wasn't love, not yet. He wouldn't dare name it so. It was a kind of release, like standing beneath a sky after long rain. But beyond the fence lines, beyond the weary cattle, the whispers carried still. Each time Caleb rode into town, the same voices followed. There goes McGraw, the fool who brought home a $2 bride. Likely more burden than help. A Boston cast-off. What good'll she do? He answered none of them. He had lived long enough with scorn, too poor, too unlucky, too stubborn to quit. One more name meant little, yet it cut at him all the same, not for himself, but for her. And Margaret heard too. She carried herself through the market stalls with calm eyes, bought flour, salt, what little she needed. She seemed unbothered. But at night, Caleb would catch the way her shoulders stiffened when she thought no one watched. Silence did not mean she did not bleed. One evening he came home to find her mending his torn shirt under the glow of a lamp. A pot of stew simmered on the table. She looked up only to murmur, "The seam was ripped at the shoulder. It won't let the wind through now." Caleb stood long before answering, only nodding. To him she was no $2 wife, as the town called her. She was Margaret, the one filling his hollow life with steady, unspoken care. Often, after chores, they sat by the fire. Caleb whittled handles for tools. Margaret stitched or read from an old book she had carried west. Few words passed, yet the silence was no longer heavy. It was a rhythm, slow and steady, as if they were learning to breathe together. At times he stole glances. Firelight touched her face, traced the braid of her hair, made her lips move softly with the words on the page. He thought of the woman she had once been, a teacher in Boston. And now here she was, piecing together shirts in his shack. The contrast stung him, and yet somehow it felt like something he had never dared to hope for had come unasked. Neighbors noticed. Smoke rose from his chimney each evening, the door no longer shut tight. Children whispered that McGraw's house smells like baking. Curiosity spread with mockery. Maybe she can work after all. Wait, she'll run soon enough. McGraw may be a fool, but luck might have softened for him. Caleb heard it all, face unreadable. But inside he knew what others didn't. His house lived again. And the woman they called worthless was proving herself stronger than most. One morning he found her at the well, hands raw from the icy water as she scrubbed his shirts. She hung them on the line, droplets shining in the sun. He walked over, wanting to speak, but instead tied another rope across for her to use. She looked up, surprised, then gave the smallest nod. No words were needed. So the days pressed forward, a new rhythm shaping itself. Margaret hadn't turned the ranch into wealth, but she had turned it into life. And Caleb began to understand. The woman bought for 2 silver coins was teaching him that worth cannot be measured by money. In the eyes of the town, she was a cheap bargain. But under his roof, she was mending more than shirts and sweeping more than dust. Without either of them naming it, Margaret was stitching him back together, and she was fast becoming the most valuable thing he owned. Night fell quicker than it should have. The sky heavy with clouds that smothered the moon and left the land in a hush of shadow. Inside the crooked cabin, the fire burned bright, its glow etching the weariness on Caleb's face and casting a steady light in Margaret's eyes. Outside, the prairie wind keened through the cracks in the boards, whispering like voices carried across the grass. Caleb sat hunched on the long bench, calloused fingers rolling a small knife, though his mind was far from the scrap of wood he carved. Before him, Margaret bent close to the hearth, mending the frayed coat he wore in winter. Her braid glimmered with firelight, her eyes fixed deep on each stitch. The silence between them was not awkward. It was the silence of waiting. Caleb knew it. For weeks he had sensed it. The woman carried a weight behind her, and tonight, the fire seemed to draw it to the surface. She set the coat aside, gaze fixed on the flames, as though staring into another time. Her voice dropped low, words slow and sure. I was once a teacher in Boston. Caleb lifted his head, listening. I loved it. The girls, the way their eyes lit when they learned a letter, a word. I thought my life would be chalk dust and books. Until he came. Her breath faltered. The fire carved the pain into her face. He was the son of a wealthy man, a pride to his family. Polished, learned, attentive, or so I thought. When he asked me to marry him, I believed fortune had finally smiled on a colored woman. I believed love could sweep away the lines the world drew. Caleb's chest tightened. He did not speak. But then I learned the truth. He had offered the same vow to another, daughter of a richer house, higher standing. When I confronted him, he laughed, told me a poor black teacher should be grateful for even a glance. Then he spread the lie that I had shared his bed. Her mouth pressed tight, her eyes fixed on the fire as if to burn away the memory. My honor was stripped. The school dismissed me. No classroom would take me back. Friends turned their backs. Everything I had built crumbled like ash. The room held only the snap of wood in the flames. Caleb sat heavy, seeing not weakness in her gaze but something rarer, courage, the kind that faces ruin and still stands upright. You've borne more than most could, he said, voice rough. Margaret turned, her eyes softening a fraction. She wasn't searching for pity. She spoke to prove she had endured and survived. So I came west, where no one knew my name. I thought I could begin again. But even here, the color of my skin and the ghost of my past cling close. Caleb nodded. He knew, not in her way, but in his own, called a failure, a man who lost his father's land, a rancher holding on by his teeth, and little more than 20 half-starved cattle. The fire cracked loud, startling her. She bent to gather the coat again, but her hands shook. Caleb reached out, resting his hand lightly over hers. That's enough. Their eyes met across the flames. In her, he no longer saw the woman bought for 2 coins. He saw a fighter, a soul battered but unbroken. The night deepened, wind clawing the walls. When the lamp burned low, they made ready for sleep. Caleb spread his blanket by the hearth. Margaret moved toward the small room, but before closing the door, she turned back. Her voice was soft, but the words cut the air clean. Your brother, the one who died in the war, he was once promised to me. Caleb froze, his heart thudding. Fate, she whispered, seems to have bound me to the McGraw name. The door shut, leaving Caleb in the dim glow of dying coals. His limbs felt rooted, caught in threads of the past he thought buried. His brother, fallen far from home, a promise never kept. And now this woman, standing in his house as though destiny had returned to finish what had been broken. He dropped into the chair, his head in his hands. The fire had burned to embers, but questions flared inside him, hot and restless. Was this a cruel twist, or a second chance laid before him? Beyond the door, Margaret leaned against the wall, her fists tight on her dress. She had spoken the truth she had hidden, and her heart hammered. Yet she knew Caleb would have to face it, and in that truth lay the cord that pulled them closer, strangers no longer, bound by something older than choice. The wind moaned through the cracks, driving dust and snow across the plain. Inside, 2 souls carried the weight of a secret that would shake all they were trying to build. That winter set in early, harsher than any Caleb could remember. By late October, the sky was already nailed shut with thick bands of gray, the wind knifing down from the Rockies. Snow smothered the Montana plain, swallowing tree stumps, burying trails, making the land one vast white silence. The McGraw Ranch was a lonely dot in that wilderness. Caleb had braced the fences with rope and new stakes, stuffed straw into the cattle shed to blunt the drafts. Inside, Margaret had hung herbs and dried stores she'd put away with careful hands. On the surface, they looked ready. That afternoon, the sky pressed low, silver light falling cold across the drifts. Caleb swung his axe at the woodpile, breath smoking in the air, while Margaret moved about the kitchen. Then came the sound, hoofbeats carrying over frozen ground, heavy, certain. Caleb looked up. From the northern road, a rider advanced, his outline unmistakable. Ezekiel Ward, the man who ruled the northern spread with coin and cruelty alike. He sat astride a great black stallion, the beast's mane slick, breath clouding like steam. Over his shoulders draped a wolfskin coat. Each hoofbeat shattered the crust of snow with a sound like breaking bone. His easy, deliberate gait was arrogance made flesh. Ward reined in at the porch, tipped his hat with mock courtesy. His smile was thin as a blade, his eyes colder than the wind. "McGraw," he drawled, "word says your herd's shrunk to less than 30 since last winter." Caleb set down the axe, standing square. "Still enough to see me through." Ward's gaze roved across the place. The sagging rails, the half-mended shed, the half-split woodpile. His lips curved. Winter don't spare fools. Your land butts my south range. Sell it. I'll pay fair. Enough for you to start over where it's warmer. Maybe back east, where you belong. Caleb crossed his arms. Not for sale. Ward cocked his head, as if savoring it. Then he chuckled, dry and low. Not for sale? Snow will choke your herd dead. Then you'll have nothing but a shack to die in. Why hold on? At that moment the door opened. Margaret stepped out, a wool shawl over her shoulders, her face lifted to meet him. For a heartbeat, Ward went silent, his eyes sweeping her. Something flickered there. Mockery, desire, calculation. So this is the new wife, he said, voice slick. I heard the story. $2 silver for a dark bride. Quite the bargain. Caleb's jaw tightened, his voice flat. My business isn't yours. Ward's gaze clung to Margaret, insolent. You've got fire in you. Reminds me of someone I once knew. Margaret stood straight, shawl clutched in her hands. She gave no word, but her eyes blazed with a cold hatred Caleb recognized. This was no stranger's name to her. The air thickened, heavy as snow clouds. At last, Ward tipped his hat again, his smile thin and cruel. Think it over, McGraw. My offers don't last forever. He wheeled, the black horse, and together they carved a dark figure against the white, dwindling until only the echo of hooves cracked the stillness. Caleb watched, eyes hard as iron. He felt it deep. The storm had only begun. Margaret stood her ground at the porch, the wind biting her cheeks but not moving her. Only when Ward's shadow vanished did she turn. Her voice was steady. He won't stop. A man like that never does. He takes until someone makes him bleed. Caleb nodded once. No need for more words. He knew. From the moment Ward's gaze fixed on her, this was no longer about cattle or land. Ward had marked something else, and that made him dangerous beyond measure. The wind screamed, flinging snow against the porch boards. Caleb pulled his coat close, but the cold inside him ran deeper than winter. He understood. From this day forward, he wasn't only fighting for soil and herd. He was fighting to hold the woman beside him, and the real battle had only just begun. That night, the wind rose early, whispering warnings through the cracks before darkness had even settled. Clouds smothered the sky, swallowing the thin new moon. Inside the shack, Caleb sat mending an old rope while Margaret fed sticks to the fire. They knew hard winters, but tonight the air carried something different, an edge that gnawed at the bones. By full dark, the storm broke. Snow lashed the walls, the roof groaned under the gale. Caleb moved to check the latch when a sound split the night. Cattle bawling, wild and frantic. His heart clenched. He snatched his coat and rifle from the wall. "Stay inside," he barked above the wind. But when he pushed the door open, the storm clawed his face, staggering him. Margaret did not obey. She wrapped a shawl, seized the lantern, and stepped after him. "You can't drive them alone," she shouted. Her eyes, unflinching, silenced his protest. They plunged together into the white roar. Snow stung their faces, swallowed the light, turned the prairie into a chaos of shadow and drift. Ahead, the corral gate banged open, rope ends snapping in the wind. The herd milled in terror, black shapes surging through the drifts. "God Almighty!" Caleb cursed, running for the gate. He waved, hollered, drove them back with raw voice while Margaret swung the lantern high. its golden beam a beacon in the white. Side by side they struggled, circling, shouting, until at last the last steer stumbled through the gate. Caleb heaved the heavy timber shut, lungs burning as if on fire. Margaret stooped, the lantern glow falling across the rope. She touched the fibers. The cut was clean, sharp, deep, not torn by wind, not broken by horns. A knife. Her eyes hardened. Someone did this. Caleb's hand clenched around the rifle. His voice was a growl. Ward. Margaret shook her head, slow, her hand still pressed to the rope. Her voice trembled, not from cold. This cut, I know it. It's a soldier's blade, a regulation dagger, an officer's issue. I know it because the man once promised to me wore one at his side. The words sliced deeper than the wind. Caleb stood rigid, the storm freezing his veins. In his mind, shards fell into place. The rich suitor who shamed her in Boston, the rumors that followed, and now, the same signature steel carved into his corral rope. Margaret stepped back, the wind whipping her braid loose. If he's here, if he's joined hands with Ward, she left it hanging, but Caleb needed no more. He laid a firm hand on her shoulder, his eyes set like iron. If he comes near, he won't take another thing. They staggered back through the storm, cloaks soaked, limbs shaking. The door slammed against the gale, and warmth spilled from the hearth like a saving hand. Caleb dropped the rifle on the table. Margaret clutched the lantern, its glow painting her face pale. They sank by the fire, breath ragged. Margaret's fingers, red with cold, trembled. Caleb caught them, rubbing warmth into her hands. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the fear, the fury, the exhaustion bound them closer than words could. Margaret's gaze held his, unbroken, filled with something more than gratitude. Trust, fierce and whole. Caleb leaned toward her, and she did not turn away. Their lips met, clumsy with cold, trembling with all that had pressed them down. It was not hunger nor claim, but two souls drawing heat from the only flame left to them. The hearth fire leapt, casting their shadows as one across the cabin walls. Outside the blizzard howled, but within another storm had broken, quiet, warm, unstoppable, sweeping away the last distance between Caleb and Margaret. At last the brutal winter gave way to warmth. Snowmelt trickled down the gullies, silver in the sun. Caleb's cattle fattened quick on the first blades of green, and with the turning of the season came a lightness in the air. Not only in the land, but within the small cabin too, where silence had once lain cold, there was now a quieter kind of closeness between him and Margaret. Word spread across the valley of the spring dance in town. It was the yearly gathering, a night when ranchers and homesteaders put aside toil, donned their best, and filled the new schoolhouse with fiddle tunes and laughter. Caleb had never cared for such things, but he watched as Margaret prepared days ahead. From her bundle she drew the one dress worthy of the name, a dark blue calico, plain but clean. She washed it, pressed it, stitched the frayed seams. From an old ribbon, faded but still carrying a hint of sheen, she tied her hair. He saw her stand before the dim mirror, and in her reflection he read the truth. This night was no pastime. It was the first time she would step before the very folk who had spat and jeered when she was sold for 2 coins. Caleb polished his scuffed boots, straightened his best shirt. When they set out in the wagon, the sinking sun gilded the land in gold. Still, silence lay thick. Margaret's hands were folded tight in her lap. "You don't have to go," Caleb said, eyes on the rutted road. Her answer was steady. "I do. I can't keep hiding." The schoolhouse blazed with lanterns. Fiddles scraped. Children shrieked with glee. Glasses clinked. But when the door swung wide and Caleb entered with Margaret at his side, the music faltered. Voices dipped. Eyes turned. Whispers rippled. "There she is, the $2 bride. A colored woman at our dance. McGraw must have run out of choices to bring that home." Margaret bit her lip, breath hard, but her spine stayed straight, her chin high. She walked the gauntlet of stairs as though each step drove a stake into the floorboards, proof she would not bow. Beside her, Caleb was silent as stone. Then, before the crowd, he turned, holding out his hand. "Mrs. McGraw," he said loud enough for nearby ears, "may I have this dance?" A hush swept the room. Margaret lifted her gaze, eyes wide, startled. Then she placed her hand in his. The fiddle struck up. Caleb led her onto the floor. Their first steps were stiff, but soon the rhythm carried them. Her dress turned beneath the lantern light, the dark cloth glowing, her braids swinging with the movement. Caleb held her steady, strong, as if telling all that she belonged, beside him. The whispers shifted. Curiosity crept in where mockery had been. "They're dancing, truly dancing. Doesn't look so bad. McGraw, of all men, bringing her here like that." The tune swelled and softened. Caleb and Margaret turned slow, eyes locked, the world around them falling away. For that moment, she was not the $2 bride, not the scorned colored woman. She was his partner, equal on the floor, seen for who she was. The music ended. A scatter of applause followed, not from all, but enough to break the weight of silence. A few faces in the crowd even held a flicker of something other than contempt, something like respect. Margaret bowed her head, murmuring thanks. Caleb bent close, his words for her alone. "Let them see. Let them know what you're worth." Her chest tightened. The words lit a flame in her, melting years of frost. All evening, they no longer stood apart. A few women came to her, cautious but curious, asking if she truly had taught children once. Margaret answered, calm, humble, with even a smile now and then. The scrutiny lingered, but the first seeds of acceptance had been sown. Later on the porch, lanterns glowing above, the night air smelled of thawed earth and young grass. From inside, the music drifted faint. Margaret breathed deep, her breath misting. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb tilted his head. "For the dance? For not letting go of my hand." He said nothing, only held her hand tighter. And beneath the lantern's glow, Margaret knew that auction of shame had begun her story. But tonight's dance had written another page, where she was no longer a commodity, but a woman, seen and honored, at least by the man who stood with her. The air inside the schoolhouse had softened after that dance. Where once suspicion had gathered, now curiosity flickered. Caleb slipped away to fetch 2 cups of hot cider, leaving Margaret standing among a small circle of women. Her heart still raced, though she held her composure. A woman in her 30s, hair neatly pinned, approached with an open smile. "You're Margaret, aren't you? I'm Sarah Miller, the doctor's wife." The simple use of her name startled Margaret. For so long, her name had only been spoken with mockery. She inclined her head with a faint smile. "The pleasure is mine." Sarah clasped her hand warmly. "I've heard you once taught school. Is that true?" Other faces turned toward her. Margaret drew a steady breath and nodded. "Yes, in Boston. I taught reading and sums to young women. It was the work I loved most." The murmur that passed through the group was not scorn, but interest. A younger woman in a lilac dress leaned forward. "Lord knows this town needs it. We've got a school now, but only one teacher for every child from 5 to 15. Another pair of hands would be a blessing." An older matron added firmly, "My daughter goes there. The poor teacher works herself ragged. If you'd lend your skill, it would mean the world." Margaret's chest tightened. For years she had been called the $2 bride, the black wife, the woman disgraced in Boston. Yet here in the center of town, someone looked her in the eye and said, "You could help." Her lips trembled into a smile. "If I can be of service, I would be glad. I miss the classroom dearly." Sarah's face lit with delight. She squeezed Margaret's hand. "Then come to the Ladies' Society next week. We'll speak to the board. We've needed someone like you." Margaret nodded. For the first time in years, light slipped into her heart. Not borrowed from Caleb, not shaded by shame, but her own. She was not a bargain bride. She was Margaret Hale, a woman of knowledge and worth. When Caleb returned with the cider, he found her surrounded by women leaning close, listening. He paused, watching her face shine, not from ribbon or dress, but from the quiet strength that was hers all along. A pride swelled in him, one he carried in silence as he set a hand on her shoulder. "See," he thought, "they're beginning to see you as I do." The fiddles struck a brighter tune. Children dashed about shrieking with joy, and Margaret's rare smile spread, her eyes alive again. But the warmth broke as the door slammed open. Cold night air rushed in. All turned. Ezekiel Ward. Clad in a heavy fur coat, boots thudding sharp on the boards, he carried with him the hush of power. His presence drew the laughter down, voices thinning to silence. He swept the room with his gaze until it locked on Margaret. His lips curled in a smile, half sneer, half hunger. Slowly, deliberately, he advanced. Margaret's stomach knotted, though she held her ground. Ward stopped before her, tilting his head, eyes raking her as though cataloging prey. His voice carried, low and cutting. "You look much like your mother. She once defied me too, and she lost." The words froze the air. The women beside Margaret stiffened, baffled by his meaning. But to Margaret, the sentence struck deep, unearthing a wound buried for years. Her proud mother standing against a rich man's greed, stripped of land, stripped of dignity, until sorrow claimed her. Margaret's eyes burned. Her voice, though taut, held steady. "You've no right to speak of her." Ward's smile widened a fraction. "I speak only truth. Her blood runs in you, and blood will learn. You can't fight me without ruin." The hall pressed silent. Caleb stepped forward, planting himself between them, voice flat with iron. "Enough, Ward. This is a celebration, not your hunting ground." For a breath the two men locked stares, steel against steel. Then Ward's laughter cut sharp. He turned on his heel and strode away, leaving a trail of unease behind him. Margaret stood still, his words coiling inside her chest. But unlike her mother, she did not stand alone. Caleb's hand touched the small of her back, steady, sure. She drew breath, and in that breath lay the truth. This fight would be hers, but not hers alone. That spring morning dawned soft and golden across the Montana prairie. Grass, fresh and green, rippled in the breeze, and wildflowers speckled the earth with purple and pink. After months of storms and nights of endurance, the air now carried a gentleness rare in that country. Caleb stood at the cabin door, filling his lungs with the warmth. This day was not like others. This day he and Margaret would truly become husband and wife, not bound by a crumpled paper or the clink of 2 coins, but by their own vow. The little church in town was trimmed with wildflower garlands and white ribbons, arranged by the women of the Ladies' Society. Sarah Miller had come early, hanging blossoms around the doorframe, straightening benches, lighting candles. The scent of pine boards mingled with wax, lending holiness but also homely comfort. As the wagon rattled along the dirt road, Margaret sat beside Caleb, her hands clutching the thin white shawl across her lap. Her dress was still the dark blue calico patched in many places, but the women had added bits of white lace, enough to soften its lines. In her braided hair, Sarah had tucked a wreath of daisies. Margaret's smile flickered as the church came into sight, though her chest trembled with nerves. For years she had known only sneers and spittle. Now the very people who once scorned her were gathering to witness her marriage, and had set their hands to make it beautiful. Inside, voices hushed at their entrance, but the silence was no longer sharp with mockery. The pews were full, faces bright. Children laughed, old women dabbed at their eyes. On the pulpit stood Reverend Thomas, white-bearded, smiling warm. Caleb's grip tightened on Margaret's hand as they walked the aisle strewn with petals. And in that moment, Margaret knew she was no longer the $2 bride. She walked proud, as though the chains of her past had been shattered and left behind. Reverend Thomas lifted his voice deep and clear. "We gather here today not to mark a bargain nor a price paid, but to witness 2 souls who have chosen each other through trials the Lord Himself has set in their path." Margaret's eyes blurred with tears. From the benches came nods, smiles, even applause. Sarah's glance shone encouragement. The young schoolteacher clutched her Bible close, eyes alight with respect. When the rings were called for, Caleb drew from his pocket a plain silver band, bought with coin saved from the hard winter. His hand trembled as he slid it onto hers. His voice, rough with feeling, rang steady. "From the day you stepped home from that auction block, I knew I'd gained more than a wife on paper. I'd found a companion, an equal partner, and a woman I love. Before all gathered here, I vow to keep this truth." Margaret drew a breath, her hands shaking though her eyes glowed. She faced him, each word sure as stone. "I came west with empty hands, carrying shame and loss. But you gave me a place to stand, a reason to keep on. Today, before this community, I am no longer a woman sold. I am Margaret McGraw, wife, friend, and the one who will walk beside you all our days." Tears fell freely, hers and those of many watching. Reverend Thomas lifted his hands. "I pronounce this union, not by paper, but by love and fidelity. May the Lord bless them until the end of their days." The church broke into applause, laughter, shouts of joy. The bell tolled bright above them. Caleb bent and kissed Margaret openly for the first time. No one jeered, Only cheers rose to meet them. Hand in hand they stepped from the pulpit, passing through faces now smiling. For the first time in her life, Margaret was called by her true name, without insult, without price. On the church steps, beneath the noon sun, Caleb turned to her, his eyes shining. From today on, no coin, no bargain will ever define you. Margaret laughed through tears, clutching his hand. She knew trials lay ahead. Ward's shadow lingered, the past not erased. Yet in that hour she had won. Against scorn, against shame, against fear itself. And so, on the threshold of that humble church, a black bride once scorned by the town stood proud, ring on her finger, embraced by her community. In her heart, a new fire burned, of true love, of faith, and of a beginning worthy at last. 10 years had passed since the day Caleb McGraw laid down $2 on the auction block, surrounded by the jeering laughter of the crowd. 10 years since Margaret Hale, the black woman once treated as a worthless commodity, stepped down from that platform in her worn brown dress with proud, unyielding eyes. Now, the scene before them was entirely different. The McGraw Ranch was no longer a rickety shack leaning against the winter winds. The old cabin had been replaced with a sturdy home, its wide porch looking out over the prairie. The cattle barn was rebuilt strong, the fences stood straight, and green pasture stretched to the horizon. The herd had multiplied, sleek and well-fed, many times more than the meager 26 left after that first winter. In summer, fields of corn and potatoes ripened golden, promising abundant harvests. In the yard, children's laughter rang bright and clear. Ruth, their eldest daughter at 8, darted across the grass with her 6-year-old brother Thomas. Both carried their mother's shining eyes and their father's sturdy shoulders. The youngest, Samuel, just turned 3, rested in Margaret's arms, his curls tight like those of his grandmother long ago. Watching them, Caleb often thought, this is true wealth. The community had changed too. No one whispered the $2 bride anymore. Instead, they called her respectfully, Mrs. McGraw. Each week, Margaret was invited to teach at the schoolhouse. Her knowledge and patience helped children learn to read and write, even sparking dreams of further education. Women from the Ladies' Society sought her advice, not only on lessons, but on how to face hardships with dignity. Caleb had become one of the region's most trusted cattlemen. He was not as wealthy as Ezekiel Ward, but everyone knew the McGraw Ranch was built on honest labor, fairness, and integrity. People respected him not only for his cattle, but for how he treated his wife. As an equal partner, nothing less, nothing more. For their 10th wedding anniversary, Caleb had prepared months in advance. He asked the town's jeweler to craft a small golden locket, inside which he placed $2 silver, polished bright. They were the very same coins he had held on the day he brought Margaret home, the only wealth he had then. Through the years, he had kept them safe, a reminder that even the humblest beginning could bloom into a miracle with faith and perseverance. That evening, as the sun cast a golden blaze across the prairie, Caleb led Margaret to the porch where they often sat after long days of work. Sarah Miller, now like a sister to Margaret, was watching the children, so husband and wife could share a quiet moment. Caleb drew a small velvet box from his pocket and placed it in her hands. Margaret's eyes widened, her lashes trembling. When she lifted the lid, the light caught on the 2 silver coins, nestled inside the delicate locket. Her hand flew to her mouth, tears welling. She touched the coins with shaking fingers and memories rushed back. The mocking laughter at the auction, the lonely road to the tumble-down ranch, the stormy nights herding cattle, the first touch of his hand, their awkward kiss by the fire, the wedding in the little church with applause echoing through the rafters, all of it captured in the gleam of $2 silver. Caleb clasped her hand, his voice low and steady. "We started with nothing, Margaret. No one believed we would come this far. But now—" He looked out at the fields where cattle grazed in the evening light. "Now we have everything. Not riches, not titles, but a home, children, and a love no one can take away." Margaret broke down in tears, tears of joy. She leaned into him and whispered, "I once thought my life had ended in Boston, but you and those $2 silver gave me a beginning. No longer shame, but a legacy for our children." She pressed the locket to her chest, the cool metal against her skin like a second heartbeat beside her own. That night, as the family gathered around the table, Caleb told the children the story of the 2 coins. Ruth's eyes grew wide. "Only $2 to buy Mama?" she asked in awe. Caleb laughed, ruffling her hair. "Not buy, my girl. Those coins only opened a door. It was your mother who gave me a life worth living." Margaret smiled quietly, watching her family bathed in lamplight. She knew prejudice would never disappear entirely. There would always be whispers of the past. But it no longer mattered. With their own hands, she and Caleb had built a home, earned the community's trust, and carved out a future filled with hope for their children. Outside, the night wind swept over the prairie, carrying the scent of wildflowers. The moon shone down on the sturdy house standing proud against the Montana sky. And within its glowing windows, a black woman, once treated as a thing to be sold, now stood as the heart of a lasting legacy. Love, family, and the unshakable truth that even from the cheapest beginnings, something eternal can grow. 10 years on, those $2 had become laughter-filled rooms, a thriving ranch, and children raised in the wide freedom of the prairie. Margaret, the woman once mocked as worthless, had become the soul of a family, a community, and living proof that even the smallest beginnings can blossom into a legacy when nurtured with patience and love. Perhaps for many of us who are older, this story recalls our own hard beginnings, days when we had little but faith and companionship. And as the years pass, we discover the greatest treasure is not land or wealth, but a home with someone to share it with. What do you think? Can $2 placed in the right hands truly change a life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story brought you a touch of warmth, please like, subscribe, and join us again for more Wild West love stories where every life leaves behind an enduring echo.